Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, whenever you're watching this. Welcome back. Hope you guys had a fantastic weekend. Now we are going to get going. We do have a Zoom meeting today, 11 a.m. If you're able to make it, great. Um, it'll be quick. Question of the day, and then just kind of a wrap session. Get things figured out, and if you have any questions, you can ask me there. But we'll go ahead and get started. So we are now wrapped up in the Pacific Theater. And in World War II, there's two theaters of war. There's the European theater and the Pacific theater. So following the attack on Pearl Harbor, which is where we left off, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, America is left bruised, worried, and skeptical about their own defense. Up to this point, America thinks of itself as undefeated in warfare, which is semi-debatable, but they do have a very impressive record in their short time as a country. So this is a big shock, this massive attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. Well, countries always have reconnaissance on each other during war, and reconnaissance is things like watching your opponent to see where they're at, whether you can fly over, take photographs, or using radar or sonar or any intelligence on your opponent's either positions or plans. And so both sides are always trying to intercept each other's radio messages, because that's how the two sides communicated, was through radio. And so both sides are intercepting each other, but everything's coded. Everything is masked, whether it's through language or through just code words, and there's a code book that they follow. Well, every so often they change their codes, because eventually you will figure out what your opponent's codes are when you have a transcript of every word they say, and then it becomes easier to figure out, oh, this means bomb, or this means shoot, or whatever. So you're able to pick it apart. So that's why every so often, like every couple months, you would change your codes. Well, the U.S. discovered a pretty effective code that they would use throughout the war, and it was using Navajo Native Americans, just their language. They would send messages to each other over the radio in their Navajo language. Now, this is unique because Navajo, or Native Americans in general, their language is unique to them. And Native Americans aren't known for up and moving all around the world and spreading out. Almost all Navajo Native Americans will be in the U.S. So the Japanese had no way of intercepting, or had no way of decoding just a basic language, because they had no access to it. So they never learned it. But the Americans learned the code of the Japanese. And the code breakers discovered that the Japanese were planning a second attack on American island, known as the island of Midway, which was an island just a little further off the coast of Hawaii. It's a Hawaiian island, but it's the furthest one away of the chain. And this wasn't going to be just a bombing or surprise attack on Midway. It was going to be an invasion of the island of Midway. And if they invade Midway, then the Japanese can then invade the rest of the Hawaiian Islands, and then they would have complete control over the Pacific. And from there, it was believed that the Japanese could invade the west coast of the United States. They could invade California, and they would get as far as Chicago before any major military force could stop them. So a successful invasion of Midway Island would prove catastrophic to America. But luckily, the code was intercepted, and the U.S. knew days in advance of the attack. So, I guess I should move this. So they engaged with Japanese in Midway, and the U.S. was able to repel. They were able to defeat the Japanese. This was a confidence boost to the American military and to the Allied forces, but it doesn't really change a whole lot immediately. Japan doesn't lose any land, and they don't really even lose many ships or planes or soldiers. They just get turned back. But what it does do is it reinvigorates the American soldiers and the American people. And from there, the U.S. is able to string a few victories together as they spread throughout the Pacific. But the Battle of Midway was huge in that it stops the Japanese momentum as they're marching their way through the Pacific Ocean. Now here's a little map, and I wanted to point out a specific place. So usually in the classroom, I'd be able to point to that big map on the wall, but I can't necessarily do that. I want you guys to find the Solomon Islands. The Solomon Islands were originally, there'd been an American controlled chain of islands there off the northeast coast of Australia. Now, during this, Australia and New Zealand were allies. Were allied countries. They were helping the U.S. and Britain and France. And the Solomon Islands was very important to the Allies' trade. Well, Japan had taken over the Solomon Islands about a year or two before as a part of their Pacific campaign, and they had pretty well cut off trade between the U.S. and Australia and New Zealand. They were able to intercept, and they made it very difficult. So, after a few skirmishes and battles in the Pacific after Midway, the U.S. engages in the Guadalcanal campaign. And Guadalcanal is one of the islands in the Solomon Islands. So this was an American attack against Japan. This was the first major Allied offensive against Japan. Now, next year we'll talk about it more in American history, but there's an agreement when America joined the war that they would put most of their effort into Europe first, and then after they defeated Hitler, then the Allies would turn their full offensive against the Japanese. But first off, America was scared after Pearl Harbor, and then they started to reel off some victories, and they decided to test their luck with the Solomon Islands. So Japan is trying to cut off Allied support to Australia and New Zealand. That's why they occupied the Solomon Islands. And the Allies, mostly the American Marines, they plan an attack. Now, they're able to sneak up on the Japanese in the Solomon Islands because of storms, made the arrival very murky and difficult to track. Now, it also made the journey itself by the Americans very difficult, but they were able to break landfall, hit the Solomon Islands, and over the course of a couple months, take certain parts of the Solomon Islands. You saw that the Solomon Islands, it's made up of many different islands. And so this was not going to be a one battle, one win. This was going to be a long and drawn out conflict for each island. And after a few months, the U.S. starts to take back some of the Solomon Islands. And eventually, they take over enough to have control over the Solomon Islands. Now, Japan doesn't just run away with their tail between their legs. Japan continuously tries to bombard the Solomon Islands to get them back. The most important part was on Henderson Field. That was an airstrip and plane base on one of the islands. And it was where the Allies had put all of their Air Force, all of their planes, bombers, escort planes, all of them, fighter planes, in Henderson Airfield. And Japan had taken some of their battleships, and they would line up. First of all, there's an engagement, a fight at another island. So the U.S. would send many of their best battleships into that fight. Well, then the Japanese would send a couple, maybe just one or two battleships to Henderson Airfield, which was right on the coast, right on the edge of the island. And they would set that ship up where there was no defense because the Americans were in another engagement in another island. And they would just sit on the water and shoot, and the Japanese ships would shoot missiles and bombs at Henderson Airfield, and they destroyed probably 2/3 of the airfield. And most importantly, they destroyed some of the fuel source for American ships and planes. And that's a huge loss. That's probably the most important thing at any kind of military base is the fuel reserves, the oil. But America was able to persevere because they smartly decided they were, first of all, able to save 1/3 of the airstrip. So they were able to take planes off, but they needed fuel for the planes. Well, the smart thing that they did was they took some old battleships that were either needing of repairs or probably never going to sail again, but were still docked or salvaged. They weren't at the bottom of the ocean. They took those ships and they drained all of the fuel out of them, or they took old planes that probably couldn't fly anymore and they drained all the fuel out of those and then used that fuel to put into planes and ships that would work. And that seems simple to us now, but at the time that wasn't just common knowledge. So they were able to get off the airstrip that way, bombard the Japanese, and push the Japanese out of the Solomon Islands. And in this engagement, Japan suffers pretty big losses. They lose about 20,000 soldiers to the U.S.'s 6,000 to 8,000. Pretty staggering differences there. And Japan is forced to push their line of influence back. And the U.S. gets one of its original chains of islands back. Now, understand that only about so I said about 20,000 Japanese deaths or casualties, only about 8,000 deaths in the actual battle. A lot of deaths are from disease or from being taken prisoner, mostly disease. These are very subtropical, humid islands that are filled with things like malaria, diseases that many Japanese nor American soldiers would have the immune system to fight because we aren't surrounded by that at home. So that was the problem the Japanese had. Now, another battle is the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which we'll talk about. Look there at the Philippines, right in the center. Philippines were an American territory after World War I that the Japanese took. They forced the Americans off the island early in the war, and the U.S. was making more progress in the latter stages of the war and decided they wanted to take the Philippines back. So, hence the Battle of Leyte Gulf. I call it Leyte, maybe it's Leyte, I don't really know. But the Battle of Leyte Gulf is known as the largest naval battle of World War I, and by some estimates, possibly the largest naval battle in world history. That's very hard to measure because old records are not well kept or even extremely accurate. But of the modern era, this is the largest naval battle. Over 200,000 soldiers were involved. So to keep it short, because I could talk about really any of these individual battles for quite a while, the U.S. had a choice. They were either going to take the Philippines or they're going to take the island of Taiwan, which is just east of China. They're both Japanese territories, and they're both pretty strategically important. But they settled on Leyte Gulf because the Philippines was a previous American territory and one that we found to be very important. And it also was home to most of the Japanese Navy oil reserves. So if we took back Leyte Gulf, Japan would be hard pressed for oil, which is incredibly important during the war. Now, during this, we see the first use of kamikazes. Kamikazes are pilots, Japanese pilots who carried out suicide missions. And the goal was to inflict as much damage as possible to their target. So these pilots would strap up all these bombs to their planes and they'd fly. They'd find the biggest ship or the biggest target with the most people in it, and they would aim that plane right for the center of it, killing themselves as well as anybody else in the vicinity because those bombs would all explode and it would be mass chaos. Now, this doesn't actually work out to the Japanese favor. It becomes kind of a desperate tactic because what happens is they lose all these. Japanese pilots were probably the most well-trained of any country in the world, even more so than American pilots. And so these kamikaze pilots are dying and they're not able to train new pilots fast enough. And they're not experienced enough when they do get fully trained. So the Japanese take a huge hit when they start losing some of their very superior pilots to these missions. So they end up entangling both in the air and on the water. And again, the Philippines is a big collection of islands. So the defeat of the Japanese will take more than a single battle. It'll take quite a few, and this takes months and months. But eventually, the Allies, which in this case, in Leyte Gulf, was mostly American and Australian, they were able to defeat the Japanese and push them out of the Philippines, thus cutting the Japanese off from their main oil reserve. The Allies lose about 3,000 soldiers, while Japan loses about 12,000. And those are important numbers. That's a big loss for Japan. So Leyte Gulf, largest naval battle in World War II, guaranteed test question. I'm already telling you. So those were two of, if not the two, most important Pacific engagements in World War II. Guadalcanal turns the tide, or first of all, the Battle of Midway put some confidence back in the American Navy. Guadalcanal starts their island hopping journey in World War II, and then Leyte Gulf basically cuts Japan off from any territory south of the equator. It cuts them off from about half the islands that they once or currently held. So things are turning quickly against the Japanese, but it's still a long way to go. Still a lot to take in. We'll get through really quickly. Now the essential question, real simple. Just went over it. What is a kamikaze? And I noticed last week a lot of, or not a lot, but some people's answers were strictly Google. Well, that doesn't show me that you listen to my lecture at all. So only correct answers will be from the notes on this one. If your answer isn't what I have in the notes from today, then it will not be considered fully correct. So keep that in mind. I made the assignment on Google Classroom, so you don't have to make a document. Just open the assignment, and it's the same thing. Monday, essential question. We'll put what is a kamikaze, and then right under that, put your answer. Okay? So that's it for today. Appreciate you guys tuning in. Again, a Zoom meeting at 11 a.m. For those of you that can make it, I appreciate it. So if you have any questions, again, do not hesitate to ask, and have a terrific day.